You're watching live now from Fox. Let's continue to get a little bit more insight on everything that has happened here with the Afghanistan collapse, the Taliban takeover, and so much more. Joining us right now via Zoom is Michael Szanto, a foreign policy expert. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Live Now from Fox. And I got to ask you, Michael, one of the key things that came from this news briefing, we just heard from the CENTCOM commander talking about that, the Taliban was, quote, businesslike during this whole process. Did you ever think 20 years ago that we would ever, the U.S., be calling the Taliban businesslike?
I know, it's quite a turn, but I think that what we've actually seen is that we're focused on Middle Eastern terrorist groups, and original conflict was about them harboring the terrorists. So I think that's one of the reasons why our interests may not diverge as much as it may have seen 20 years ago.
Okay, and then, Michael, can you also just talk about, we heard about the Pentagon talking about just about 100, on the low end of the hundreds of Americans that are still left behind. Who are these Americans that for one reason or another are still there or didn't want to leave? That's according to the U.S. officials there.
Well, some of them may be dual citizens, people who are of Afghan ancestry, and they might have had a little bit of trouble getting past the Taliban checkpoints around the airport. I can't really, go into the detail and say every single person because I don't think we know. But what I can say that the military, in a very unexpected, probably poorly planned, originally, the way we pulled out of Bagram, managed to overcome and get so many people out over such a short time. So once again, in many ways, we do see how effective our military is. Now that they're out, it's going to be trickier to get American citizens and Afghan allies out. And I know what I said might have seemed a little bit confusing, but my point often is that the terrorist groups are often predominantly Arab. So there is this ethnic issue. I'm not trying to give the Taliban a free pass for harboring or helping in many ways these terrorists, but they're, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are by and large Arab in origin, and that creates an ethnic difference.
That's very good to note there as well. And can you also, Michael, just help us break down for our viewers really a timeline of events here? So we had the Trump peace deal when President Trump was in office. And then what happened from that time when the deal happened to where we are right now?
Well, there was a postponement of a few months of the pullout. We had a little bit of a period with the transition between two different administrations where you had a little bit of a power vacuum, unfortunately, perhaps in D.C., where not everyone in the Biden administration was in place. So that is going to probably historians are going to note, just like with 9/11, they're going to, there was a finding that one thing that hampered the Bush administration was the fact that there was a transition that was a little bit difficult. Nobody really on the outside understands what was the rush to pull out of our largest air base in Bagram. That's very confusing. That appears to be a major miscalculation. Also rushing to remove all of our contractors that have kept the Afghan military, particularly its own Air Force assets, going was incredibly disruptive to the Afghan military. But the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and securities forces pretty much caught everyone by surprise, even the Taliban themselves. There appears to have been false rumors spreading in the presidential palace itself in Afghanistan. And, I wonder, maybe the Russians also played a role that in addition to very effective strategy on the part of the Taliban, because obviously the Russians wanted us as humiliated as possible.
As you say, it was a surprise there for so many, including the Taliban, of the fast collapse there of Afghanistan. But for our military leaders that have been there for 20 years, There had to be a time when they continued to train the Afghan military that maybe it just didn't seem like they had it in them, because when you see a total shutdown from the Afghan military so fast, they had to know some of these people just weren't in it for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. I mean, there has to be some blame placed. Was going up the chain of command, accurate information saying, these guys are not up to the task. This isn't working. I would roughly even say maybe 10 years ago, but President Obama had a surge. And then since that period of time, there was a reduced U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. So it wasn't like we went full out. I think it was a valiant effort. It was a little bit of clear mission creep. We went to punish the Taliban for harboring al-Qaeda terrorists, which originate largely a different region. We got Sudan, for example, to kick out bin Laden, and he was forced to go back to Afghanistan. I think trying to create a modern society and government in this chaotic country, which was a unfortunate place where terrorists have found useful, was a valid, very worthy effort. But did we have to focus on Afghanistan as opposed to other unstable regions where that could harbor terrorists? I think that's a little bit of a question. We tried, and maybe we stayed too long. Actually, maybe it was clear the handwriting might have been on the wall for a decade, to be honest. It's kind of like a doctor who doesn't give up on her critically ill patient. I don't think, maybe people are making money out of it too, but I don't think people should get too cynical. I think it's honest mistake. It's hard to, admit defeat sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you also have the private contractors there and really privatizing military. That's a whole nother ball game to talk about there as well. But Michael, can you maybe just talk a little bit too about the weapons and really the equipment that is now left behind there in Afghanistan? I mean, does the Taliban now do just a major sale to all the bad people in the world? And how do we know that these bad actors aren't going to be getting our equipment and use it against us?
Well, if we see intent behind the Taliban providing weapons to terrorists, we'll start by, that would be a major violation of a peace agreement, and that would be an act of war against the United States. We wouldn't have a big ground presence again, but we would bomb them. That would be a terrible mistake for them. They would pay dearly. Any material support to terrorists against the United States, our allies, would cost the Taliban dearly. I don't think this new leadership would survive. They'll either be living again in caves or hiding wherever, or no longer with the living. That would be a terrible mistake on their part. I don't think that people should agonize about these weapons as some huge American national security risk. The United States does provide weapons to many, many allies, and a few of them, unfortunately, have less than perfect stability. And we give it to them anyway, because the choice would be to let them collapse. Now, we might have chosen poorly in the case of Afghanistan, but over many decades, I would include Jordan. Maybe Lebanon seems a little bit more confusing because it's partly controlled by a terrorist group. But we provide weapons to many countries, most of them very close allies. We don't sell weapons to as many countries as the Russians or the Chinese or other countries. And the Defense Department always knows the risk, but you frankly have so much former Soviet weapons out there and so much Chinese weapons that are easy to buy. There's a black market and a not so black market that terrorists have access to. So a lot of things we're talking about are, Humvees, we're talking about Jeeps, we're talking about trucks, we're talking about small arms. So we lost part of our investment. That's part of the money we invested in Afghanistan. And we're at risk of losing that investment in the sense that we have not succeeded in creating a stable democracy in Afghanistan. And that was part of the money we spent. But I don't see that as making a meaningful difference clearly strategically, but even in terms of the terrorist threat, they unfortunately already have access to assault rifles and other military-grade weaponry.
So 123,000 people evacuated from Afghanistan. How do we know that some terrorists didn't slip through the cracks there and are on our way to our country or other countries that are taking in the refugees? How does the U.S. government really vet 123,000 people during still when there was a war raging on?
Well, I mean, that is a constant battle because people do come into the United States, people do come into Canada, and before COVID, we had fairly open borders with Canada, and our borders with Mexico are not entirely closed. There's ways of visas, obviously. There's people who go back and forth every single day. Not as much, obviously, because of COVID. The issue of people sneaking in, it could be on a marriage visa. There are many people who come here. In one case, unfortunately, a very strong, close ally, Saudi Arabia, had one of their service people turn their weapons on us recently in Florida. So it's an ongoing battle. It's complex. We're dealing with people who self-radicalize or who are part of these ISIS or even perhaps still Al-Qaeda networks, or God knows, it could even be Hezbollah one day. There's other terrorist groups of concern. It's an ongoing battle. Many of the people who were given visas from Afghanistan had access to our military bases. So many of them were probably extensively vetted. They had some sort of background check through FBI, although that's difficult because FBI would have to, there's limited Afghan records. Many people would be fingerprinted, have pictures. So there's a lot of accounting there. And also, if they do arrive in the United States, there is a processing that is involved with everyone who comes to the United States. We can't completely hermetically seal our borders. That was an issue even with trying to keep out COVID. So there's a risk. It's an ongoing risk, but it's a one-time event. I don't think it's going to statistically significantly increase the risk of terrorism. It's an ongoing threat. And over the last 20 years, terrorist attacks, thank God, have been limited against the United States. And, there's always a chance. So there will, unfortunately, most likely, just odds are, be future terrorist attacks. But the main thing is to prevent catastrophic ones like 9/11.
All right, Michael, and last question here before we wrap up. We do have a State Department. Looks like we have the Secretary of State, Blinken. He will be giving some remarks here as well as the U.S. warplanes have officially now left Afghanistan. My final question to you, Michael, is now that the U.S. is officially out of Afghanistan, what happens now to the Afghans that are there right now and having no U.S. support anymore? How much do they fear for their lives and really their whole way of life now that for the last 20 years will now be shaken up in a whole different situation?
Very good question. It's an enormous concern right now. In the United States, there's no question, partly let these people down. The visa should have been processed over years. Many of them should have left over a few years. We knew this was coming. There was the Afghan peace deal, and many of them were just eligible, and they were at risk even when things were more stable because the Taliban could come kill them even before they had taken over. The Taliban have turned very pragmatic. They're now in charge of this country. The hope is that we could encourage the Taliban to have a more inclusive government. We do have a lot of leverage, especially economic, and maybe they're able to maintain or at least one day in the near future revive some of what we brought to Afghanistan in terms of being modern.
Well, Michael Szanto, thank you so much for breaking it all down for
us. You're very welcome.
Yes, at the conclusion there of that Pentagon briefing, we totally appreciate your insight, and thank you again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.